a 500% tariff on Russian oil will stop the Indians and the Chinese buying it. Whatever kind words they give to the Kremlin, Modi and Xi are not going to pay that, especially if they can buy oil from the Americans or the Saudis for less than $50 a barrel. So yeah, I think that is a really demonstrative way. And if Russia's overseas oil sales will virtually dry up.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. A reminder, you can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on our YouTube channel. But joining me today, I'm delighted to say, is Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former British Army colonel. Hamish, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
So we are talking today after you wrote a piece earlier this week where you said that Donald Trump has now realised that both Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin at large think he is an idiot. What do you mean by that, and how do you think he has come to this realisation?
Well, I think this has been building for some time, and we've discussed before that over the previous sort of few weeks and months, in all the negotiations that Trump has been having with the Kremlin and with Putin, it's very easy to get the impression that he's more on the Russian side than the Ukrainian side, and at the very least, we expect him to be the honest broker to bring both together. And it just seems that he had been playing into Putin's hands, and really, Russia was getting absolutely everything they wanted, and Ukraine was not getting anything. In fact, there was no indication of any ceasefire, and everything coming out of the Kremlin was exactly that. The Russians really wanted to push on, and they were getting under no pressure from Trump to do it. And even 2 weeks ago, when Putin, at the request of Trump, organized or said he was organizing peace talks in Istanbul with Zelensky, Zelensky turned up, but he didn't. And then over the weekend, particularly the one that's just gone, where there have been massive drone and missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. Eventually, then Trump came out and gave his immortal sort of words that Putin was absolutely crazy, and that Trump was very, very cross. It's something that I suppose the rest of us who follow this very closely had realised, but it took that. Now, those sort of strong words, it seemed that there was at last a chink of light appearing with Donald Trump, and even delayed his golf match over the weekend, which is pretty exceptional, to make these comments. So it is, I think, a realisation, and Trump has also said it, and his close advisors, that they now realise that Putin has no interest in peace or a ceasefire, which for the rest of us is a, flip an egg, about time too, with all the death and destruction going on. And a lot of Ukrainian civilians have been killed in the last week of these, really targeted drone and missile attacks, despite the fact that the Russians say they're attacking military targets. And I said in my piece, not even the most cynical observer, even in Moscow, can believe that every Ukrainian hospital and school is housing military personnel. Clearly it's not. Clearly this is Putin's attempt to subjugate the Ukrainian population, but he should have realized by now, having attacked them so directly, that actually attacking Ukrainian civilians is making them stronger and more determined. So I think it just, not just Trump, but some of his other close advisors, General Kellogg, the special envoy to Ukraine, has again today really been stating similar views, and also others close to the American president. So that's where it comes from. Trump, hopefully the penny has dropped, that actually Putin is not his friend. Putin is the enemy of the United States, as well as NATO and Ukraine. And it's really Trump's gift to try and move this forward and move the dial forward to a ceasefire, because if we leave things are at the moment, the Russians are keep on attacking, and there is, credible intelligence that building a large force near Sumy in the sort of northeast to attack, and they are preparing to try and grab other bits of ground as well. So quite apart from the staffers in Moscow writing more peace plans, they seem to be writing more attack plans.
Well, obviously, you mentioned he made that post on Sunday where he said Vladimir Putin was absolutely crazy. But I think he turned the dial up even more last night. He wrote in another post that what Vladimir Putin doesn't realise that if it weren't for me, lots of really bad things would have already happened to Russia. And I mean really bad. He's playing with fire. That fire that he talks about, I mean, is that sanctions? Is that action coming down the road?
Well, I think it's a number of things. Interesting that Putin's rather crazy attack dog Medvedev has commented on those in the last sort of half an hour or so, saying, well, if Putin wants World War III, a nuclear attack, he can get it. But I don't think that's what Trump's talking about, at all. But what he is, I believe, and I agree with you, this is probably sanctions. We know that the Russian economy is pretty much in free fall, except for the military sector, except for building tanks. Everything else is really suffering badly with interest rates, inflation rates, and the sanctions not allowing Western kit in. I mean, I gather Putin today said he was going to stop buying Western kit, but he was wearing an Italian suit, I believe, and a French tie, and speaking into a German microphone. So, a lot of this is sort of bluff, and bluster as well. But when it comes to sanctions, we know that the majority of the Russian Western jets, the Airbuses and the Boeings, haven't been serviced properly for 3 years, and that's affecting them. The drones are affecting Russian airports. And even the Russians can't get to their sort of, summer coastal resorts in Sochi and elsewhere. But the most telling thing will really be the hydrocarbons, the oil. We know that the Saudis and the Americans are pretty determined to force the price of oil below $50 a barrel, not necessarily, directly to affect Putin, but for their own financial gains. But what it would do is really dry up the foreign currency that Putin is absolutely reliant on to keep his war machine going, because below $50 a barrel, he cannot maintain it. He cannot make tanks on thin air. And if Trump decides to really turn up the dial on that, then that will have a severe impact, because apart from the oligarchs in Moscow, people are struggling to feed themselves. The price of bread and price of food generally, and the availability of it, is getting pretty stark. So I think that is really what Trump is focusing on, and let's hope he does follow through with it, because it's, again, in the piece that I wrote, I said that is the most likely way to get all sides around the peace negotiation table and the 30-day ceasefire that everybody really is screaming out for, except for Putin. But if he knows that his military machine is going to grind to a halt as people don't buy his oil, then that might be the thing that tips him over. And hopefully, now that Trump is angry enough and realizes quite how badly he has been playing this so far, that he will action it, and we can make progress on a ceasefire.
Well, it is sort of just rhetoric coming out of the US at the moment, but there are reports that there has been a sanctions package with sort of cross-party support in the US. And some of the reports I read said that it could include 500% tariffs on countries buying Russian energy. You just sort of touched on it there. I mean, what would something like that do to Russia? And should we not at all be concerned about how the Kremlin would respond to something like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are two sides to this, obviously. If a 500% tariff on Russian oil will stop the Indians and the Chinese buying it without whatever whatever kind words they give to the Kremlin, Modi and Xi are not going to pay that, especially if they can buy oil from the Americans or the Saudis for less than $50 a barrel. So yeah, I think that is a really demonstrative way. And if Russia's overseas oil sales will virtually dry up. Now, the dangerous inference is, what would Russia do? Well, I think people are, of course, always concerned about the nuclear piece. But as we've discussed before, I think this is, a chimera, a mythical beast idea. The issue, without unpacking the whole nuclear piece, is about nuclear equilibrium and parity. And that is what we have with the Americans, the Russians, and the Brits and the French. Where I get a bit more concerned is if the Americans insinuate that they might not go nuclear, as it were, if Europe was attacked. And I don't think there's any suggestion of that. The only suggestion of that is coming out of the Kremlin rather than elsewhere. So I think those the concern that Putin would go nuclear, if his oil dries up. Yeah, I just do not think that is going to happen. I personally believe that his army is reaching its culminating point, which is the military term for saying, yeah, it's just run out of steam. It's run out of manpower, or it hasn't run out of manpower. The manpower it's got are very poorly trained and equipped. And actually, they don't have the ability to make any great strides, as we've seen over the last at least 18 months on neither side, apart from last summer where the Ukrainians made a bit of an incursion into Kursk and took about 1,000 square kilometers, but that's now pretty much gone. But advances on the front line are similar to the First World War. We're talking meters, not kilometers. So I don't think there's an awful lot that can be done. And when you hear the verbose rhetoric coming out from the Kremlin spokesman Peskov and Medvedev, really trying to persuade America not to do this, you sort of know that you're onto a thing. So I think sanctions are probably the only way that we can get to a ceasefire quickly. And we should not be overly concerned about some of the hot air coming out of some of, the so-called advisors to the Kremlin that we've already mentioned.
You talk about that noise coming out of the Kremlin, and earlier this week, I think you said that Donald Trump has to avoid becoming the American Gorbachev. What did you mean by that?
Well, that was not a complete throwaway line. Gorbachev is seen by the Kremlin, certainly the current crew in the Kremlin, as somebody who sold out Russia, and it's unfortunately at the moment Trump is potentially affecting America's global position as the world leader, the dominant economy. Certainly in the short term, his talk about tariff seems to be affecting the American economy more than it does the rest of the world. And his inconsistency and bouncing from one side to another is losing the influence of the US, which is the criticism that I'm sure Putin would put against Gorbachev. And actually, there are mutterings within the Kremlin that and they're hoping that Trump actually is the American Gorbachev, who is the one who's going to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. So again, in my piece, I describe that as a potential. Let's hope that there are. Well, hope is a strange word to use here, but there are a lot of advisors around Trump now that he has realised, or somebody's told him, how badly he's playing Putin and Putin's running rings around him. Hopefully he'll also realise that, Trump is a great legacy person as well, hugely vain, and wants to, he's told us he's the greatest US president, but actually the way he's going at the moment, he could be remembered more as the American Gorbachev rather than the greatest American president to walk this earth.
Well, one piece of policy that definitely has shifted this week is around the cruise missiles. I just want to talk about the Taurus KEPD 350, which could be on its way to Ukraine soon via Germany after the Chancellor Friedrich Merz announced that Western allies have now lifted all restrictions on providing long-range missiles to Ukraine. How significant is that?
Well, I think there are two things here, Fergus. First of all, Friedrich Merz, who's really changed the whole position of Germany as far as peace in Europe goes, and as far as facing down the Russians. I think a lot of us have been very disappointed. The Germans, who, this massive country, massive potential, very large army, admittedly, not a terribly well equipped one at the moment, who ambivalent might be a strong word to use here, but the previous German administration have sat so firmly on the fence, they probably hurt themselves, and they certainly haven't helped Europe. But Merz seems to be far more forward-leaning on this. The Germans have already announced that they're going to change their policy on rearmament, and they're looking to allocate 200 billion euros over the next 5 to 10 years, I think, to develop their military. That is hugely significant. So that's on the one side. Then, as you mentioned, that Merz said in a briefing earlier this week that all the restrictions on Western missiles had now been lifted. Now, we understood that was the case for some, but with the advent of Taurus, now nobody knows yet whether Taurus missiles are on Ukrainian jets and in Ukraine. And that ambiguity, I think, is probably helpful in this case, because with all Western missiles now lifted their restrictions, it means that Ukraine can hit strategic targets up to 500 miles into Russia. Now, this is hugely significant because, first of all, the air bases where Russia is launching a lot of these missiles and aircraft with the cruise missiles on to attack Ukrainian cities are within 500 miles. So if Ukraine can take them out, that will damage the Russian Air Force even more, but more importantly, will push them further and further back. And the further back they get, the more difficult it is for them to attack, certainly deep into Ukraine. It also means that all the logistics hubs where they're focusing their ammunition and fuel and everything else are under direct threat, and they'll have to be pushed back. Extending your lines of communication in this sort of war makes life really, really difficult. The final bit to this, it brings Moscow in range. Now, we have already, and we've spoken about Ukrainian drones affecting airports in Moscow, which is really upsetting the Muscovites. But actually, if cruise missiles that you can put through a window and blow big buildings up could be attacking Moscow, then to me, certainly psychologically, that's massive. We've seen how perturbed Putin's become about his own personal security. We've seen several or a couple of very senior Russian generals assassinated in Moscow, presumably by the Ukrainian Secret Service. But now, if things like Taurus, which the Russians have had real difficulty in knocking down, these are very sophisticated, clever missiles. Without getting the complete details, something like Taurus flies at sort of treetop height, and then when it gets to its target, it jumps up and puts a hell of a punch into it. Very, very difficult, even for the most sophisticated air defenses, to take down. So I think this again puts another dynamic in there. And if Muscovites, and only today we're seeing that Ukraine drone attacks overnight have taken out a key electronics facility that the Russians make their semiconductors for their drones deep into Russia. And if Muscovites then sort of fear that they're actually, in danger in their own beds, as virtually every Ukrainian is in their beds in towns and cities across Ukraine, I think that will have a significant impact. So with that, with the threat of Trump's sanctions, let's hope that this ceasefire will come to fruition sooner rather than later. Although, however, today I've just seen that the staffers of Moscow are saying, yeah, okay, we'll have a ceasefire. However, the conditions behind it are pretty extreme. Lifting of sanctions against Russia, Ukraine to be a neutral country, no NATO for Moldova and Georgia as well, and the complete subjugation of the four oblasts and Crimea. Each time the Russian staffers write a ceasefire plan, it seems to add another condition that is totally unacceptable. So, my final bit on this, it goes back. I think Trump holds the cards here. If he flexes his sanctions piece, then Putin is clever enough, I think, to realise that his operation will be numbered. His army probably couldn't fight beyond the end of the year if he can't buy stuff with his oil, which is the inference. So, heck of a lot going on at the moment. A lot of diplomacy. Let's hope that Trump, doesn't get bored again and switches to other things. He seems to be on the ascendancy. Let's hope he realises that and sort of drives the point home rather than gets confused and goes off and does something else that perhaps he thinks interests him more and might make him more popular and make more money for America, where actually peace in Europe is the thing that will really help the American economy, I expect, more than anything else.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I don't know if you're familiar, there's a new term that is trending on Wall Street, which is the taco trade, which I believe stands for Trump always chickens out. It's sort of in reference to, his trade policy. We saw the tariffs on Liberation Day scale back. Then we saw the 50% threat on the EU last week scale back. I guess my question is there any fear that if we do see decisive action from Trump on Russia with the imposing of tariffs, can we be sure that these won't then be scaled back at a later date?
Well, unfortunately we can't, and the taco piece is that is the buzzword knocking around at the moment, and it's not difficult to come to that conclusion because Trump does change his mind so often if things aren't going swimmingly well. But I suppose for him, his greatest achievement or possible achievement would be peace in Europe. And let us hope that, I've discussed him in my piece today, having the skin of a rhino and, being completely oblivious to, a lot of the criticism that's happening. But if he can realise that he might have made a mess of a whole host of things, particularly on the financial side, but if he can get this ceasefire and peace, then he will be hailed as a great US president. If he messes this up as well, then he will really be hailed not just by the Russians, but probably by the rest of us as the American Gorbachev.
And just finally, there is obviously the other fear that him and his administration could decide to walk away, as they've threatened before. Where do you stand personally on that? I've spoken to people on this show. Some people say, that would be totally disastrous. Some people think it would be a blessing in disguise.
Well, I think with all of these things, it depends whether your cup's half empty or half full. So, I like in these sort of things, your cup's got to be as full as possible. So, in both ways, one would hope that it wouldn't be a disaster. I personally think that Trump staying engaged and fully engaged at the moment is the quickest way to get to a ceasefire, and that's what everybody wants. They want the killing to stop, most especially on the Ukrainian side. They are the people who have been wronged, and I personally believe the quickest way to do that is with Trump, turning up the sanctions and keeping the US engaged, keeping the US military on the horizon. But, we have learnt over the last few years, and particularly over the last 100 plus days, that Trump can be a little bit fickle and is prone to change his mind, as often as the wind changes direction. And we have to plan for that. And I think European leaders are probably planning for it. So ultimately, I think if Trump does walk away and retires to his golf course in Florida, and we have to get on with it, I think the European countries now have the military wherewithal and hopefully have the political backing to actually make a difference. Because however the Kremlin and the Russians dress it up, actually a European NATO force that is all coordinating and working together is vastly militarily superior to anything that the Russians have. Now, obviously, we don't want to go down that way. We want to create a ceasefire, by negotiation, by sanctions, or whatever. But ultimately, I think one just has to listen to the Poles and the Baltic states. They're all expecting Putin to attack them if he prevails in Ukraine. And I think in Europe, we realize that he can't. And ideally, Trump will come in and make sure that doesn't happen. But if he doesn't, we have to plan for the Europeans ourselves to do it. So it's might be a glass almost full view, but I think in these things, you've got to be as positive as possible. And it's all about psychology and letting the Russians know that we're serious. As soon as I think Putin sees a gap or sees any fraction within the coalition of the willing, within the Americans, then he is one who respects strength and exploits weakness, and we must show strength. And initially, that strength of strong sanctions, I think, is the most likely way to success.
Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, we always value your expertise on the show. Thank you for coming back on the Trump Report.
Thanks very much for having me.